Praise God once more. Help me by welcoming your neighbor to the house of the Lord. Kama uko na jirani unaweza msalimu kwa sasa, hata kama ni kuwave. Just a smile. At least we have been given the privilege to smile and be seen once more. Yes. So my name is Jimmy Mbethi Nzioki, and today I'll be sharing let me call it a simple message ambayo nimepea the title Your Possession, Your Miracle. Jambo kutafsiri katika Kiswahili nikaa kusema unachokimiliki ndio chanzo cha miujiza wako. So your possession, your miracle. And we'll have some scripture reading, and taomba nisaidiwe pia kwa Kiswahili from 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 1 to 7. 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 1 to 7. Basically it's the story of a widow who's unnamed. We are not given the name, but we remember this story because of the miracle that she received. So 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 1 to 7. So I'll read in English and then my brother Crispus will follow it up with Kiswahili. Okay, so the widow's oil. 2 Kings 4, 1 to 7. It says, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a little oil. Elisha said, go round and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Verse 4, then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. Verse 5, she left him and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. So there are 5 observations. Now, 5 observations that I'd love to share with you. I dubbed it the 5 D's from the widow's story. Observation, kuna jambo nikisoma hiki kifungu nilikuwa naangalia na tafakari nikaona kuna vitu ambavyo tunaweza kujifunza kabla hata ya kuendelea zaidi na hii hadithi. Jambo la kwanza, the first thing was there was death. So that's the first D. There was death, and somebody in this story had died, and it wasn't just any other person. This was a prophet in his own right. He was like under the pupillage or tutelage of Prophet Elisha. What will happen in years, in that time, the same way we go to school to be taught a particular course, the same way some of the prophets will be under the tutelage of a particular or a higher prophet. Let me just use that word. Kama anaitwa the prophet kwa Kiswahili, nabii. Sasa tuseme ka nabii mkuu alikuwa na manabii wengine ambao alikuwa anawafunza mambo ya kunabii ama kueleza neno la Mungu. And this husband, we are told he was a good person and he revered the Lord, but there was a problem. This person, now leading us to our second D, is there was a debt. He died but left a debt that had to be borne by the wife and the children. So that's the second observation I saw. So the first one was he died, there was death. And then the second one is he left a debt. And because he had left a debt, as much as he was a good person, you remember the king Hezekiah, when he was very sick and about to die, the Lord told him one thing: put your house in order. And this is part of the things that for those who are already in families, that you need to look keenly at, that you don't die intestate, or usikufe kama hauna will. Kwa Kiswahili will and testament it is hard to translate, but kuna ile mnaelewa, mtaniwia radhi kwa sababu Kiswahili sikizungumzi kwa kawaida kila wakati. Nimezoea Kizungu na Sheng, so ukipotea nielewe. Yes. So this person, as much as he was a God-fearing person, he died intestate, or he died without a will and testament. And he left this debt as a burden to the family and the wife. And the third observation that I saw was there was despair. So there was death, there was debt, and now there was despair. And why was there despair? Because this widow did not know what to do. And that's why she went ahead and sought help from the chief prophet, who was Elisha. Yani kwa Kiswahili ni alifadhaika. Alikuwa na tatizo ambalo aliona angesaidika tu na mtu mmoja ambaye alikuwa nabii Elisha. And then the other D that I saw, another observation that I made was there was direction. She received direction. Let me call it divine direction. Why? Because in verse 3 to 4, we see the prophet asking the widow, or giving the widow instructions on what to do in order to get out of the trouble that she was in. And then in verse 7, we see another, I can make another observation, the last D, which is there was deliverance. So there was death, there was debt, there was despair, there was direction, and finally there was deliverance. So those are the 5 observations that I was able to make out of this story of the widow's oil. And from this passage and others that we are just about to read, we are very familiar with them. And the next passage will be from Matthew chapter 14, verse 15 to 21. Matthew 14, 15 to 21. Before we draw lessons from the widow's story and the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, we'll have a look at Matthew chapter 14, verse 15 to 21. Matthew 14, 15 to 21. Maybe we can have it read in Swahili and then I'll expound.
Amen. Nitasoma kwa Kiswahili. Ilipofika jioni, wanafunzi wake wakamjia, wakamwambia, mahali hapa ni nyikani, na muda sasa umekwisha. Wahange makutano ili waende zao vijijini wakajinunulie chakula. Yesu akawaambia, hakuna sababu ya wao kuondoka. Ninyi wapeni chakula. Wakamjibu, tuna mikate 5 na samaki 2 tu. Akawaambia, nileteeni hivyo vitu hapa. Kaangiza makutano wakai chini kwenye nyasi. Akaichukua ile mikate 5 na wale samaki 2. Kainua macho yake, katazama mbinguni, akavibariki na kuimega ile mikate. Kisha akawapa wanafunzi wake hiyo mikate na hao samaki na hao samaki. Wanafunzi wakawangawia makutano, wote wakala wakatosheka. Nao wanafunzi wake wakakusanya vipande vilivyosalia, wakanjaza vikapu 12. Idadi ya wale watu waliokula walikuwa wanaume 500,000. 5,000 bila kuhesabu wanawake na watoto.
Okay. Still in the same book, now we go to the reading of, the feeding of the 4,000. And we read that in the next chapter, Matthew 15, from verse 29 to 39. Taomba tusomewe pia kwa Kiswahili.
Nitasoma kwa Kiswahili. Yesu akaondoka na kwenda kando ya bahari ya Galilaya. Kisha akapanda mlimani akaketi huko. Umati mkubwa wa watu ukamjia, wakiwaleta vilema, vipofu, viwete, bubu na wengine wengi. Wakawaweka miguuni pake, naye akawaponya. Hao watu wakashangaa walipoona bubu wakisema, vilema wakipona, viwete wakitembea na vipofu wakiona. Wakamtukuza Mungu wa Israeli. Kisha Yesu akawaita wanafunzi wake akawaambia, ninahurumia huu umati wa watu, kwa sababu sasa wamekuwa pamoja nami kwa muda wa siku 3 na hawana chakula chochote, nami sipendi kuwahanga wakiwa na njaa, wasije wakazimia njiani. Wanafunzi wake wakasema, tutapata wapi mikate ya kutosha kuwalisha umati huu wa watu mkubwa namna hii, nasi tuko nyikani? Yesu akawauliza, mnao mikate mingapi? Wakamjibu, tunayo mikate 7 na visamaki vichache. Yesu akawaambia, yule umati wa watu waketi chini. Kisha akachukua ile mikate 7 na wale samaki, naye akisha kushukuru Mungu akavimega na kuwapa wanafunzi wake, nao wakawapa ule umati wa watu wote. Wakala na kushiba. Baadaye wanafunzi wakakusanya vipande vilivyosalia, wakajaza vikapu 7. Idadi ya watu waliokuwa wanaume ni 4,000 bila kuhesabu wanawake na watoto. Baada ya kuanga ule umati wa watu, Yesu aliingia chomboni akaenda sehemu za Magadani.
Thank you. Asante. So from this passage, maybe before we dig deep into the lessons that you have learned from all these passages that you have read, maybe you might ask yourself, how come it's called the feeding of the 5,000, but then they are not counting women and children? So the reason that I read somewhere and they were saying is it was not permitted in the Jewish culture for men and women to eat together in public. So that's why, as the author was writing, Matthew and even Mark, in all the Gospels, they wouldn't tally the women and children because they weren't eating together. So that was a cultural practice in Jewish tradition. So that's why it's called the feeding of the 5,000, but they're just counting the men. And also the same case for the feeding of the 4,000. So in case you wondered and were asking yourself internally, mbona wanawake hawako wanahesabiwa na walikula bado? So that is the reason. And there are 7 lessons I'd love to share with you from this passage. And if you have somewhere to write, we can move together. So the first lesson from both accounts, both the feeding stories in the New Testament and the widow's oil in the Old Testament, the first lesson that I picked was, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. What do I mean by that? The widow acknowledged that the husband had left a debt. See, that's true. The widow acknowledged the debt of her late husband. The disciples acknowledged their inability to provide food for the crowds. So that's the first lesson that I saw. You cannot change what you don't acknowledge. Hawezi badili jambo ambalo haujakubali, si ndio? Ukiwa na shida, kubali uko na shida. Wakati uko mgonjwa, lazima ukubali enyewe niko mgonjwa, acha niende wapi? Hospitali ama hospitalini. Na hivyo ndo this widow did. She acknowledged the death of her husband, and the disciples acknowledged their lack in providing for these crowds. And this leads us also to another lesson that we can pick from all these passages. And it is, evaluate what you do have, however little. Evaluate what you do have, however little. Remember the title of our sharing today is Your Possession, Your Miracle. And from there we draw this lesson. Evaluate what you do have, however little. And why do I say that? The widow claimed she had nothing. She said she had nothing, yet she had some little oil. So maybe you can ask yourself, or maybe you can help me preach by asking your neighbor, is there something that is so little that you do not count as worthy of? Hauihesabu kwa sababu ni kidogo sana. Maybe you can ask yourself that. Is there something you possess, but you don't count it as a blessing because it's so little, or it seems very insignificant? And to reinforce this, the disciples said they only had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This was in the feeding of 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So mikate 5 na samaki wawili. And when Christ also asked them in Matthew 15, in the feeding of the 4,000, they said they had only 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. I believe labda ilikuwa omena, ndo maana waliona sasa hii ni kidogo, ndo maana wakaita a few small fish. So my question to you will be, what is that God has blessed you with, but you think it is so insignificant that you don't count your blessing? I think in one of the Bible studies we were learning, was it on a Thursday or a Friday? And Thursday or Sunday. And there was this phrase that I had read somewhere a while back, but it stuck with me. And it said that, do you count your blessings, or do you think your blessings don't count? Do you count your blessings, or do you think your blessings don't count? And that's what the disciples and this widow, the widow declared boldly, I have nothing. Yet she had some little oil. The disciples the same. They felt like they had something very insignificant. And in our eyes, they seemed justified. Because your ratio ni kubwa. It's like 1 to 1,000. And that's why they said, watume. Watume waende. Walikuwa wanaambia Yesu, watume waende wajinunulie chakula. And the third lesson that I can extract from this story is, have faith that what you possess is the solution to your problem. Have faith that what you possess is the solution to your problem. The widow, like we said, the widow had oil and the disciples had food. And from here we see that God uses what we are currently in possession of. I'm reminded of Moses when they were just about to cross over, or rather to cross through the Red Sea. And God used the one thing that Moses always carried, and that was his staff. Back when he was receiving the call to go back to Pharaoh and ask for the release of the people, the same staff, the one thing that he possessed is what God used to perform miracles in Egypt and to bring about the 10 plagues that were there. So have faith that what you possess is the solution to your problem. And then the fourth lesson has to do with obedience. And I put it this way: obey divine instructions. After all, it's more important than sacrifice. And I'd like us to read 1 Samuel 15, 13 to 14. And in the same chapter, verse 19 to 22. This gives us a background of King Saul. And I'll ask my brother Crispus to read that for us. 1 Samuel 15, 13 to 14.
Amen. Nitasoma kwa Kiswahili. 13 to 14. Samueli alipomfikia Sauli akamwambia, Bwana hakumbariki. Nimetimiza yale Bwana aliyoniagiza. Lakini Samueli akasema, nini basi huu mlio wa kondoo masikioni mwangu? Huu mlio wa ng'ombe ninaosikia ni kitu gani?
Thank you. So from this small passage I've read in 1 Samuel 15, 13 to 14, we hear, or rather we see Saul saying proudly and confidently, telling Samuel, in English it says, the Lord bless you, and it has an exclamation mark. So it's something that he said as something he meant. The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But then, Samuel's response tells us that he did the exact opposite of what he had said. The instruction, if you read the chapters that come before, he was not supposed to take any spoils of war. He had gone, his mission was very simple, in the sense that he was told, go and wipe out the Amalekites. Everything. In the military, they might call that a red flag mission. A red flag mission is whereby it calls for total annihilation of every living thing. And this was the same kind of mission that God had given to King Saul. But then Saul reasoned and thought, why should I kill these animals? Why should I kill these fat cows and sheep and healthy livestock while I can offer them as a sacrifice? And that was not God's divine instruction. If you read the history of why God wanted the Amalekites wiped out, you'll have to go back to the stories that were there in Numbers, and also in Numbers, and also as you read in Exodus. During their journey in the wilderness, the Amalekites did something despicable. There's a rule of war, or there's a unwritten, let me call it an unwritten rule in war, that you only attack people who are in uniform, and that is, an army cannot engage a civilian. Ni kama jeshi ikienda kupigana vita, jambo ambalo watafunzwa ni kwamba hawafai kuguza mtu ambaye hawezi kujikinga ama hawezi kujipigania. And that's why in the current state the world is in, Russia will be called to account because of engaging civilians in a war. So the same thing, the Amalekites picked out, in any kwa msafara yoyote ambayo iko na watu wengi, kuna wale wanyonge, si ndio? Na hawatatembea na nguvu ya wale wote. Ni kama hata kwa wakati wa election, kipiga foleni, kuna wale waja wazito, kuna wale ambao ni wazee, wanapewa nafasi ya kwanza waende mbele. So when the Israelites were running away from the Amalekites, those who were weak were left behind. And those are the people the Amalekites killed. And that's one thing that God instructed Moses to tell the person who would help them later, that for that thing, that evil act that they did, that they had to be wiped out of the face of the earth. But then a king comes generations later and starts to reason that I can take spoils of war. And spoils of war are things that are gathered as a result of winning, or as a result of a conquest. So you might have asked yourself, why was Samuel angry with Saul? And that was the reason. It was a war that was to be finished generations ago, but now this king comes and reasons later that there's no need to wipe out everyone. In fact, if we read verses 19 to 22, we see the consequence of his disobedience. And we read, why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. So he made a very terrible error. One, he said, as in the olden days, even the Romans had this habit of, they will massacre a whole army, but they will ensure they remain with the king, or the commander in charge will remain alive, and they will be paraded before everyone, so that they show utter humiliation to the defeated enemy. But this wasn't God's instruction. And if you do your research well and read through, there are people who say that this Agag had a son, or there's someone from his descent that later we come to read. Those who have followed through history will tell you that Haman, you remember Haman from the story of Esther? It is said that Haman was a direct descendant of Agag. Now look at the same hatred that Haman had for the Jews. The same blood and hatred that the Amalekites had for the Israelites. So that was the net, let me call it the domino effect of what King Saul's failure costed nearly the execution or extermination of the Jews in a kingdom, in Persia. This Haman, this person who wanted to kill all the Jews in Persia. So that's the cost of disobedience. So from our lesson, we say that obey divine instructions. God has a reason for telling you to do what he wants you to do. And then another interesting lesson we can learn from these stories that we have just read is personal responsibility is not to be delegated. Personal responsibility is not to be delegated. You should never delegate your own personal responsibility. And why am I saying that? The disciples wanted to avoid the responsibility of catering for the crowd's needs, the crowd's physical needs. They wanted Jesus to send them away. And on the contrary, the widow accepted the responsibility of paying her late husband's debt. So that's a contrast. The disciples didn't want anything to do with the crowds or meeting their physical needs. But this widow was wise enough to accept the responsibility of her late husband's debt. And maybe a word of caution to us. Now, learning from this widow, it can be said, or rather, it is said that creditors have the right to take action against you if you do not pay your debt. And I'll share some interesting statistics regarding debt. We may accuse our government of borrowing heavily. But do you know, us as a people, us as Kenyans, I included, we are very much guilty of this aspect of borrowing excessively. And this one is mainly targeted towards us as the youth. And this is a statistic that you can actually find. It is estimated that by the end of 2019, over 500,000 Kenyan youth had been listed by the Credit Reference Bureau, known as CRB, for borrowing money. And that's not the worst bit. They borrowed money purposely for betting. Betting. SportPesa, Betika, name them. 500,000 Kenyan youth. And it might seem funny, or it might seem like it's shocking, but wait until you enter a campus and you find, at that time, when SportPesa was still the main betting firm in Kenya, people will wake up or sleep as late as 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., watching tennis matches so that they can bet. Not even football. Tennis. And others will go as far as researching teams in Africa. This is not even EPL, for those who follow football. Teams in Africa. Teams in League One. League One is like the lowest league. Kabisa. Ni kama mimi nianzishe timu yangu hapa Olekasasi, tuende tucheze na watu wa Rongai. Such teams. Betting in a bid to gain quick money. And now this goes to the rest of us. Another statistic. It says that according to the CBK, the number of Kenyans listed with CRB had reached 3.2 million in 2020, up from 2.7 million in 2019. This is an actual statistic of where we are as a people, or where we have been as a people. And basically the lesson here to take home is, understand this. Proverbs 22:7, I'd like us to read it together and also to have it read in Swahili. And then I'll give you another quote that talks about this. Proverbs 22:7. We can read together. We can read together. Proverbs 22:7. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. And someone made this interesting comment and said, modern day slaves are not those in chains, but people trapped in debt. I'll repeat. Modern day slaves are not those in chains, but people trapped in debt. If the wisest man in the world, Solomon, could make such a statement, that, especially the second part, the borrower is servant to the lender, it's something to think about. Something to really, really think about. And then another interesting lesson we can pick. Now this is point number 6. Accompany faith with deeds. Increase and maximize your capacity. And I'll expound more. Accompany faith with deeds. Increase and maximize your capacity. And here is what I can say regarding the story of the widow's well. Remember, the oil stopped flowing when no other jar could be found. Yani ile mafuta ambayo alikuwa ile baraka yenye huyu mjane alikuwa nayo ililingana na kiwango ama kipimo ama tuseme idadi ya vibuyu ambavyo alikuwa nayo. So here I can say this, the problem is not in the supply, but the containers or receivers capacity. you'll be limited. Sometimes your own capacity will be limited. And that will be, the problem is not God giving. The problem is in your receiving. Your capacity. Your blessing is as large as your capacity. And why do I say this? Maybe I'll break it down. What do I mean by increasing your capacity? Just something to help us appreciate this point even better. There are two definitions that I came up with. And the first one is making the effort to improve your current level of ability. And the second one is enlarging your present ability to receive more from God's heavenly storehouse. And why do I give that second definition? In Malachi, we learn that in our giving of tithes, so long as we do not rob God of his portion, he says that he will open his floodgates, or his other versions will put it as storehouse, his heavenly storehouse, to pour out blessings to you. And here with me, I have like 5 ways in which we can improve or increase our own capacity. The first one, advance your skills to avoid becoming obsolete. In short, upskill and update. Upskill and update. Advance your skill to avoid becoming obsolete. Upskill and update. Let me explain this. Some professions require continual training. Other than the basic training you received, you need to go for further studies. This applies in so many technical fields. And those who are already there can tell you that even lawyers and judges, Alvin is here, anaweza kueleza zaidi. Yes, there is the 4-year period that you have to go through formal schooling. But then it doesn't end there. There's an additional training that you have to take. And updating is making yourself aware of what's happening around you in regards to your field. That is what we call to update. And upskill is to advance your current level of training or knowledge. So upskill and update. That's the first practical way of increasing your capacity. And number 2 is learn, unlearn, and relearn. Learn, unlearn, and relearn. I'll use a simple example. Even drivers are, if you are to advance to drive some vehicles, like let's say you've been driving a normal matatu, you are required, if you want to drive something like an ambulance, you have to learn some new skills. Or if you want to ride something like a trailer and you are used to a certain class of vehicles, you are required to relearn and learn some more. And that is what they will call defensive driving. It's an additional training other than the basic training that you got. And learning and unlearning. Maybe there are things that you are taught, not even practical, even matters scripture, matters faith, but you are not taught the full truth. And those are the things that you need to and relearn in its place. And someone once said this, that the illiterate of the 21st century is not the one who cannot read or write, but the one who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. So it's a practical way of increasing your capacities, not only outside there, but also in matters faith. And then number 3, another way of practically increasing your capacity, invest your resources wisely. And your major resources is your time and money. Look at the parable of the 10 talents in Luke 19:11-27. In this parable, we learn something, that God expects a return on his investment in you. He didn't give them just for fun. In that parable, Each person was given according to their ability. And looking at something interesting, the world, even people who do not know the Bible, they call Matthew 13:12. I'd like us to read that portion together. And we can have it also read in Swahili. Matthew chapter 13 verse 12. The world outside there calls this the Matthew effect. And it's something that we are all very familiar with. Matthew 13 and verse 12. We can read together in English and then we'll have it read in Swahili. It says, whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. It's a principle the world out there uses. And they call it the Matthew effect. And they call it that because it comes from the book of Matthew. Let me give you a practical example. In Hollywood, where all the sources of movies come from that have a global, or rather in the entertainment industry, they're the highest level, the star role is usually given to someone who already has starred in other movies. Hawatatafuta newcomer. No. They will give it to someone who has already starred in either a similar capacity or a different but higher capacity. Hao ndo wale watu utafutwa ili wa act kwa hizo movies. And the same thing, in that world, they recognize that there is this thing we call the Matthew effect. We can have it in Swahili. Tusikie na tuambie aje.
Amen. Tasoma kwa Kiswahili. Kwa maana yule aliye na kitu atapewa zaidi, naye atakuwa navyo tele. Lakini yule asiye na kitu, hata kile alicho nacho atanyang'anywa.
Thank you. So another example I will use is endorsements in business. You'll find someone like Eliud Kipchoge, because of what he has achieved, companies will come and use him as a brand ambassador. Does it mean that he's becoming a brand ambassador because he lacks? No. Because of what he has already achieved, he is attracting more. And that's the principle behind the Matthew effect. And then the fourth point, as I come to wind on this part of increasing your capacity, is don't just work hard, work smart. And here, I'll use two scriptures. There's Deuteronomy 28 verse 12 and Galatians 6 verse 7. So Deuteronomy 28:12, I can read that quickly. It says this. Deuteronomy 28:12. The Lord will open the heavens, the storehouse of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season, and to bless all the work of your hands. You will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. Here, my emphasis will be this portion that says, to bless all, not some, all the work of your hands. Somebody made a joke and said that God doesn't just bless your hands, he blesses the work of your hands. And that's a principle, it's a divine principle. You don't work in the New Testament, we read in one of the Pauline epistles, and he says, if you do not work, don't eat. And then Galatians 6:7. Hiyo ngependa tusomewe pia na Kiswahili. Galatians chapter 6 verse 7. It says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Galatians 6:7. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows.
Msidanganyike, Mungu hadhihakiwi. Kwa kuwa kile apandacho mtu ndicho atakachofuna.
Asante. And here there is something napenda to share. It says God instituted work for man before the curse or before the fall. Man worked. Yani Adamu alikuwa akifanya kazi kabla ya dhambi kuingia duniani. Kwa hivyo inatuambia kitu moja, kufanya kazi ni jambo ambalo ni la baraka na ni Mungu mwenyewe aliidhinisha. Kwa hivyo usiseme hard work is a curse or working hard is a curse. It's not a direct consequence of the fall. It pre-existed the fall of man. And then the last way to increase your capacity, a practical way of increasing your capacity, always remember God and trust in Him. Always remember God and put your trust in Him. Why do I say this? Deuteronomy 8:18. I think we have come across it severally in our Bible study. Deuteronomy 8:18. I'll just summarize it because of time. And it is the same. It's the verse that says, Deuteronomy 8:18. Remember the Lord your God, because it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth. Oh, it's here. Thank you. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your forefathers, as it is today. So God is the source of all resources. And if you can acknowledge that, when things are going well, you will remember the source of all your resources or your wealth. And then Psalm 20 verse 7. Psalm 20 verse 7. This is more like a caution to us to always remember God and trust in Him. Psalm 20 verse 7. Psalm 20 verse 7 says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. So a question to you, maybe you can help me also by asking your neighbor, what are your chariots and what are your horses? What are your chariots and what are your horses? Just a question to think about. This was a psalm, I believe, of David. He, being a king, knew the importance of chariots and horses in war. Because in war, if you've ever watched a movie set in such times, chariots and horses were never at the front line. You had the foot soldiers. After the foot soldiers, ndo nyuma yao unapata kuna horsemen. And not just any horsemen, they were also chariots. And this was considered as the might of any king. The higher the number of chariots and horses you had, the higher the likelihood of you winning a war. And our modern day chariots and horses, what are they to you? Perhaps it's something you've really put your trust in instead of God. That because I have XYZ, this can't happen to me. Because I possess ABCD, this cannot happen to me. So a question to ask yourself and a reminder, beware of your chariots and horses. Then back to the lessons that we are picking from this story. Maybe I'll help us by recapping the 6 points and then move to the last one as I come to a close. And you can say it with me if you wrote it down. So lesson number 1 is, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. And then the second point was, evaluate what you do have, however little. And point number 3 was, have faith that what you possess is the solution to your problem. Number 4, obey divine instructions. After all, it's more important than sacrifice. Number 5, personal responsibility is not to be delegated. And then point number 6, accompany faith with deeds. That is, increase and maximize your capacity. And then the last point from all the passages we've read is, God does not bless us so that we become extravagant. God does not bless us so that we become extravagant. He expects us to be stewards of His blessings. Why do I say this? the disciples were instructed to do something. After they had fed everyone, they were expected to do what? Collect the leftovers. So in short, there was no wastage. Expects us to be stewards. And maybe a fun fact here. The 12 baskets mentioned in the accounts of the feeding of the 5,000 were possibly the lunch baskets of the 12 apostles. This is something I got somewhere from a Bible commentary. Ndio saying, hizo vikapu 12 ni kama zilikuwa vikapu ambazo wao walikuwa wafuasi wa Yesu walikuwa wakitembea nayo kama chakula chao. So as much as there was the feeding of the 5,000, all the disciples had something to go home with. And that is why they were instructed to collect the leftovers. And maybe you might ask yourself, what about the 7 baskets? So here it is said that the 7 baskets probably contained a higher capacity. That's why they were not 12, like in the previous case of the feeding of the 5,000. And that's my conclusion of today's sharing. I hope you've been blessed.